The first day, Amara's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her backpack, steeling herself before walking into Ridgeview Middle School. She loved school, the familiar rhythms of study and structure. It was like home to her. Still, this morning felt different. Amara had heard murmurs about her new teacher, Mr. Randall. Some students called him the Hawk for his sharp gaze and firm stance on discipline, and his reputation for tough but fair had preceded him. A few older students, though, had mentioned something darker, that his gaze lingered longer on students like her, and his tone grew colder when addressing them. With her mother's words echoing in her head, "Stand tall, be brave, and never let anyone dim your shine," Amara strode forward, straightening her shoulders as she entered the bustling hallway. Locker doors clanged open and shut, and clusters of friends caught up on their summer stories, adding to the hum of anticipation for the new school year. But as she made her way through the familiar path to her classroom, Amara felt a pang of discomfort, wondering if the rumors about Mr. Randall had any truth. The classroom door was slightly ajar, and Amara took a steadying breath before stepping in. The room was orderly, almost excessively so. Desks sat in perfect rows, and Mr. Randall's desk at the front was meticulously organized, with stacks of papers arranged neatly. Yet the room seemed to lack warmth. Something about it felt cold. She scanned the faces, noting the familiar mix of middle schoolers adjusting to their new routines, and spotted an empty seat halfway up. As she slipped into the chair, she caught her first glimpse of Mr. Randall. Mr. Randall was tall and thin, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His posture was rigid, and his face held an expression of deep-set lines that suggested years of restrained sternness. When his gaze lifted from his papers to land on Amara, she felt the intensity of his stare. For a moment, it was as if the room quieted, and the noise around her faded. His eyes narrowed, not in welcome but in judgment. Trying to brush off the uneasy feeling, Amara settled in her seat, smoothing her skirt and arranging her notebook, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Randall's gaze had marked her in some way. The bell rang, and Mr. Randall's voice cut through the chatter with a tone that was as cool as it was commanding. "Good morning, class," he began, a sharp edge underscoring his words. He quickly launched into the syllabus, listing classroom rules and expectations. The students seemed to sense the unyielding structure he imposed, with whispered comments about his strict grading and disciplinary measures. As the lesson progressed, Amara noticed that Mr. Randall hardly acknowledged her, even as he paused to address or encourage other students. Throughout the class, Amara focused on her work, determined to stay true to her resolve of being the best version of herself. As a diligent student, she aimed to engage, answering questions and taking notes. When she raised her hand to respond to a question, though, Mr. Randall's response was chilling. "Yes, Amara, is it?" he said, enunciating her name as though tasting something unfamiliar. His gaze held hers briefly before shifting away, and he moved on to the next student without even acknowledging her answer. Amara felt a pang of hurt, but kept her chin up, hiding any trace of the unease he caused. As the days passed, Mr. Randall's treatment of her became more pointed. He would call on other students repeatedly, but ignore her raised hand. At times, he seemed to be actively finding fault with her work, marking down assignments for minor errors, and making passive-aggressive comments. One day, he looked over her latest homework, his lips curling ever so slightly as he muttered, "I expected more effort," before handing it back without a further word. The other students began to notice, some casting sympathetic glances her way, while others simply avoided getting involved. Amara, however, decided that she would not let him see her falter. She worked late into the nights, preparing thoroughly, and even enrolled in a tutoring program to ensure her assignments were flawless. But Mr. Randall's behavior continued. One afternoon, as he walked past her desk during a group assignment, he murmured to the students nearby, "Some of us need to work twice as hard just to catch up," in a tone so low that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Amara heard it clearly, and she clenched her fist beneath the desk, a mix of anger and hurt bubbling inside her. When she finally went home that day, her father, Marcus, noticed the unusual tension in her posture. Marcus had spent most of his life in law enforcement and had recently joined the FBI, a fact he had always kept private out of caution and respect for the work he did. With a gentle hand on her shoulder, he asked, "Rough day, kiddo?" Amara hesitated, not wanting to worry him. "It's nothing, Dad. Just school stuff." But Marcus could see beyond her words. He had always encouraged her to talk about any problems she faced, believing that honesty and courage were the best ways to face adversity. "You know, sometimes the hardest challenges come from the people who are supposed to guide us," he said, his tone calm yet firm. "But those are the times when we have to stand the tallest." Amara met her father's gaze, the same steely resolve reflected back at her. "I won't let him get to me, Dad," she said, more determined now. "I'll prove myself, no matter what he says or does." Unbeknownst to her, Marcus had already begun to suspect that there was more to the story. He decided to do a bit of quiet digging into the school's culture and, if necessary, into Mr. Randall himself. For now, though, he let his daughter find her path, but he remained close, ready to support her. As Amara returned to school the next day, a new strength surged within her. She would not let Mr. Randall's narrow view dim her spirit, and she silently promised herself that she would continue to strive, if only to show him and everyone else who doubted her that she was more than capable. This silent resolve would carry her through the trials ahead, with her father's support unseen but unwavering. Beneath the surface, Amara's determination held strong in the days that followed. She focused on her studies, putting in her best efforts, even as Mr. Randall's antagonism became more overt. She hoped that by excelling, she could somehow win his respect, or at least prove herself worthy of fair treatment. But it became apparent that her hard work only seemed to fuel his disapproval. One Friday morning, Mr. Randall assigned a group project on the American Civil Rights Movement, a subject that Amara found both inspiring and deeply personal. She had spent many weekends with her parents visiting historical sites, where her father would tell her stories of resilience, courage, and the fight for equality. She was thrilled to dig into this project, seeing it as an opportunity to highlight the powerful legacy of those who came before her. However, her enthusiasm was met with immediate resistance. Mr. Randall assigned her to a group with 2 students who had reputations for not pulling their weight. When Amara politely asked if she could switch groups to work with students who were also motivated, Mr. Randall's response was as cold as it was dismissive. "This is not a buffet where you can pick and choose," he said with a tight smile, his voice loud enough for the entire class to hear. "Part of learning is dealing with the cards you're dealt. Some students think they're too good to handle a challenge, but that's not how the real world works." Amara felt the sting of embarrassment as her classmates turned to look at her. She fought the urge to respond, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She'd been taught that respect for authority was important, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Randall was testing her patience. As she worked on the project, Amara found herself shouldering most of the responsibility, doing research and organizing materials. The other students barely contributed, and any attempt to engage them was met with indifference. When the presentation day arrived, she stood alone at the front, having to present on behalf of her group. Despite the circumstances, she delivered the speech with confidence, speaking passionately about civil rights, the sacrifices made, and the ongoing fight for equality. But instead of recognizing her effort, Mr. Randall dismissed her work with a nonchalant wave of his hand. "Your presentation lacked group synergy," he commented dryly. "Next time, try to foster more teamwork." Amara clenched her fists, but she forced herself to smile. "Yes, Mr. Randall," she replied evenly, though inside, she could feel the weight of his double standards pressing down on her. She began to see how Mr. Randall's treatment wasn't just about her performance or behavior. It was rooted in something deeper, something darker. When she returned home that evening, her mother could immediately tell something was wrong. But it was her father, Marcus, who understood without her needing to say a word. His years of experience in law enforcement had trained him to notice subtle cues, and he could read the frustration in his daughter's eyes. "Want to talk about it?" he asked, offering her a warm, reassuring smile as they sat down at the kitchen table. Amara hesitated but eventually nodded. She recounted the details of her interactions with Mr. Randall, careful to keep her tone respectful. But the hurt in her voice was unmistakable, and Marcus listened intently, absorbing each word. "You're handling it well, Amara. But remember, you don't have to face this alone," he said, a thoughtful expression on his face. "There are ways to address things like this without compromising your principles." The next day, Marcus discreetly began looking into Mr. Randall's background. He accessed public records and read through school forms, hoping to find any indication of previous issues. He reached out to a few acquaintances, asking if they'd heard anything about teachers at Ridgeview who'd shown questionable behavior. He didn't want to interfere directly, but he also couldn't stand by while his daughter was treated unfairly. For now, he'd keep his findings to himself, waiting for the right time to act. Meanwhile, Amara found herself increasingly isolated in class. Mr. Randall's subtle tactics continued, ranging from ignoring her raised hand to marking her down for minuscule errors, all while praising other students openly. Once, she even overheard him talking to another teacher in the hallway, muttering something about students who think they're special. She knew he was talking about her, and it hurt more than she wanted to admit. One afternoon, Amara arrived early to class, hoping to get a few minutes to review her notes in peace. As she settled into her seat, she noticed Mr. Randall's notebook left open on his desk. Though she knew it was wrong to look, her curiosity got the better of her, and her eyes briefly scanned the page. There, written in Mr. Randall's unmistakable handwriting, were names listed under various labels. To her dismay, she saw her own name, underlined and marked with a small note, entitled, "Needs Humbling." Her heart sank, and a wave of anger surged through her. She had always prided herself on her humility and kindness, values instilled in her by her family. To see herself reduced to a label was a blow she hadn't anticipated. The school day dragged on, but Amara's thoughts kept drifting back to that notebook. How could someone who was supposed to guide students treat them with such bias? She decided then and there that she wouldn't let Mr. Randall's opinion define her. She would rise above, no matter how challenging it became. Later that evening, she shared her day with her father, who listened patiently as she described the humiliating discovery in Mr. Randall's notebook. Marcus's jaw tightened, and his calm exterior masked the anger he felt. But instead of reacting rashly, he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You are brave, Amara," he said, his voice steady. "Some people, even those who should know better, may try to put you down because they can't see beyond their narrow views. But you're stronger than that, and know that I'm here for you every step of the way." Feeling a renewed sense of support, Amara took her father's words to heart. She knew that she had a powerful ally in her dad, and though he hadn't revealed the extent of his role in the FBI, she sensed that he was prepared to take action if necessary. In the days that followed, Amara continued to give her best effort, remaining respectful yet resolute. She knew that Mr. Randall's opinion of her was unlikely to change, but her self-worth didn't depend on his validation. She began to reach out to friends outside of class, finding solace in their kindness and support. She also connected with her school counselor, subtly sharing her experiences without directly implicating Mr. Randall, hoping that small steps might eventually lead to change. As for Mr. Randall, he continued his routine, seemingly unaware that his carefully guarded facade was beginning to crack. He didn't know that Marcus was quietly gathering evidence, preparing for a moment when Mr. Randall's actions would no longer be hidden behind closed doors. And he didn't realize that his attempts to humble Amara were only making her stronger, more resilient, and more determined to rise above his prejudice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal more than Mr. Randall expected. For now, though, Amara would hold her head high, strengthened by the knowledge that she was not alone in this battle. Rising tensions. The weeks drifted by with a strange duality. Amara's spirit grew more resilient, yet Mr. Randall's actions became more blatant. His disdain for her no longer hid behind subtle remarks or cold stares. He began to vocalize his dissatisfaction in ways that echoed across the classroom, the edges of his words cutting deeper with each passing day. What had started as veiled remarks now bordered on open hostility, and her classmates noticed. One rainy Monday, Amara walked into class prepared for a presentation on influential historical figures. She had spent hours researching Harriet Tubman, inspired by her courage and unwavering dedication to justice. Amara felt a powerful connection to Tubman's story of resilience, and as she took her place at the front of the room, she felt a swell of pride. But as she spoke, detailing Tubman's journey and the risks she took to save others, Mr. Randall's face remained impassive, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. When she finished, her classmates clapped politely, some even whispering compliments as she returned to her seat. Mr. Randall, however, remained silent. He waited until the applause died down, then glanced around the room before speaking. "Interesting choice, Miss Williams," he began, his tone laced with an unmistakable condescension. "But I can't help but wonder if you truly grasped the significance of these events. I expected more depth from a presentation on such a weighty topic." Amara's cheeks flushed, embarrassment prickling at her skin. She had poured her heart into the presentation, and Mr. Randall's words cut sharper than he likely realized. She bit her lip, holding back the retort that begged to escape her mouth. Her father's advice echoed in her mind. "Don't let anyone diminish your shine, no matter who they are." She nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Randall. I'll keep that in mind for next time." But her calm response only seemed to irritate him further. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "I should hope so," he muttered before abruptly dismissing her with a wave. Next presenter. The incident left Amara feeling shaken, but as the day wore on, she began to notice a subtle shift among her classmates. Several of them approached her at lunch, offering words of encouragement. One of them, a girl named Lily, placed a comforting hand on Amara's shoulder. "Don't let him get to you," Lily said quietly. "We all know you worked hard on that presentation. He's got issues." Amara gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Lily. It means a lot." Her classmates' kindness bolstered her, but the situation with Mr. Randall continued to escalate. It seemed that every time she spoke, he found some way to undermine her, challenging her opinions in a way that bordered on aggressive. During class discussions, he would counter her statements with an almost biting edge, dismissing her views while encouraging others to debate hers openly. It became a pattern. Amara would contribute thoughtfully, only for Mr. Randall to single her out, subtly yet pointedly questioning her intellect. By now, Marcus had become increasingly aware of the toll Mr. Randall's behavior was taking on his daughter. Though he admired her resilience, he also saw the strain she carried, the exhaustion that crept into her voice when she spoke of school. Marcus knew it was time to take action. One evening, as Amara finished her homework, Marcus sat beside her, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Amara," he began, his voice calm yet firm. "You've handled this situation with more maturity than most adults could. But I don't want you facing this alone anymore. It's time we address Mr. Randall's behavior, and I want to make sure we do it the right way." Amara looked at her father, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. But how? He's a teacher. I don't know if anyone would believe me." A knowing smile spread across Marcus's face. "There are ways, trust me," he replied. "Sometimes people need a reminder that their actions have consequences, and Mr. Randall is no exception." With Amara's permission, Marcus reached out to the school board, framing his concerns in a respectful but firm email. He mentioned his position within the FBI only briefly, but the title carried enough weight to ensure his voice would be heard. He laid out the incidents with Mr. Randall clearly and concisely, highlighting the patterns of bias and the emotional impact it had on his daughter. To further support his claims, Marcus encouraged Amara to document her interactions with Mr. Randall in a journal, which she had already begun doing as a way to process her feelings. Meanwhile, Marcus gathered additional evidence, speaking discreetly with a few of Amara's classmates who had witnessed Mr. Randall's treatment. With their parents' permission, he obtained statements from several students, all corroborating Amara's experiences. His approach was measured and careful, knowing that a rash confrontation could potentially make things harder for his daughter. But beneath his calm exterior, Marcus's resolve was fierce. He had spent his life fighting for justice, and he wouldn't allow anyone to undermine his daughter's dignity. Back at school, Mr. Randall remained oblivious to the mounting scrutiny, continuing his discriminatory behavior with an almost brazen confidence. But Amara's classmates had started to rally around her in small ways. They gave her supportive nods in class and deliberately included her in discussions, providing a buffer against Mr. Randall's attempts to isolate her. Lily and a few others even began to speak up when Mr. Randall criticized her unfairly, subtly challenging his authority by redirecting the conversation. One afternoon, Mr. Randall assigned an essay, announcing it with his usual tone of indifferent authority. "I expect nothing less than excellence," he said, his gaze briefly settling on Amara with a pointed stare. "Some of you need to start meeting higher standards." Amara returned his gaze calmly, refusing to let his veiled remark unnerve her. As she worked on her essay, she poured her feelings into her writing, crafting a powerful piece on the importance of standing up for oneself in the face of prejudice. It wasn't just an assignment. It was a testament to her journey, a declaration of her resilience. When the day arrived to turn in the essays, Amara handed hers over with a quiet confidence. She knew her work was strong, that it carried a message her teacher would not easily ignore. But she also sensed that Mr. Randall would likely find fault, even if just to prove a point. Later that day, when he returned the essays, her suspicions were confirmed. Mr. Randall's red pen had scrawled across the margins, nitpicking minor issues, his comments harsher than necessary. Unfocused, he had written at the top, underlining it twice, "Lacks critical thought." The sting of his words sank deep, but Amara met his gaze with unwavering composure, refusing to let him see the impact. Mr. Randall seemed almost disappointed by her lack of reaction, his face twisting in a subtle frown before he moved on to the next student. That evening, Amara shared the experience with her father, who listened intently, his face unreadable. When she finished, Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "It's time," he said simply. Over the following days, Marcus began taking the steps necessary to escalate the situation. The school board responded to his initial email, agreeing to a meeting with Mr. Randall, the principal, and a few witnesses willing to speak on Amara's behalf. Though Marcus had hoped it wouldn't come to this, he was prepared to lay out every instance of mistreatment, backed by Amara's documented evidence and her classmates' statements. The date of the meeting approached, and Amara found herself torn between relief and trepidation. She didn't know how Mr. Randall would react, but she trusted her father. In the meantime, she continued attending class, her quiet strength undeterred by Mr. Randall's attempts to undermine her. Each day, she grew more certain of her worth, bolstered by her father's steadfast support and the small but meaningful gestures from her classmates. As for Mr. Randall, he remained unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, confident that his authority and reputation would shield him from accountability. But Amara knew better now. She was no longer just the quiet, diligent student he had targeted. She was a fighter, standing on the shoulders of those who had come before her, ready to face whatever came next. The gathering storm. The atmosphere at Ridgeview Middle School had shifted in ways that Mr. Randall couldn't ignore. He sensed a subtle unease, as though something unseen was taking root around him. Students who usually avoided eye contact now held his gaze a fraction longer, and there was a newfound confidence in Amara's stance that he couldn't quite place. As days passed, Mr. Randall's patience began to wane. He became more abrasive in his remarks, almost as if trying to reassert his authority. The students felt the chill in his demeanor, especially during interactions with Amara. Yet, she held her ground, knowing she wasn't alone. Her father had promised her support, and her classmates had begun rallying around her in quiet but significant ways. Meanwhile, Amara prepared herself for the upcoming meeting, which she and her father had been formally invited to by the school board. Marcus had shared the details with her carefully, respecting her right to know what was happening while also providing reassurance. Though she felt nervous about confronting Mr. Randall in such a formal setting, she trusted her father's judgment. This was a battle that demanded dignity, not aggression. One evening, as the meeting approached, Marcus sat with Amara at the kitchen table, reviewing the documentation they had prepared. Each instance of unfair treatment, each incident of prejudice, was meticulously recorded, not as a weapon but as a shield, proof that Amara had endured more than any student should. "You've shown incredible strength, Amara," Marcus said, pride evident in his tone. "Remember, this isn't just about you. By standing up, you're showing others that they don't have to accept mistreatment, no matter where it comes from." Amara nodded, feeling the weight of his words. It was a bittersweet responsibility, one she hadn't asked for but was now determined to uphold. "I won't let him silence me, Dad," she replied, her voice steady. "I want to make a difference." The day of the meeting arrived, and Amara walked into school with her father by her side. He dressed in a crisp, dark suit, his presence exuding a quiet strength that gave her confidence. Word of the meeting had spread, and whispers followed them through the halls. Some teachers gave her encouraging nods, while a few students clapped as she passed, a silent show of solidarity. They'd reached the principal's office, where a small group awaited them. The school board representative, Mrs. Hayes, was a stern yet compassionate woman known for her dedication to equity. The principal, Mr. Thomas, looked tense, his gaze shifting between Amara and Marcus. And there, in the far corner, sat Mr. Randall, his face a mixture of disbelief and resentment. Mrs. Hayes began the meeting, her tone calm yet purposeful. "We're here today to address some serious allegations of misconduct and discrimination within Mr. Randall's classroom. Amara, thank you for your courage in bringing these concerns to our attention." Amara felt her heart race as all eyes turned to her. She took a steadying breath, glancing at her father, who gave her an encouraging nod. Her voice, though soft, was unwavering as she recounted her experiences, detailing each incident with a clarity that came from months of holding it all inside. She shared the impact Mr. Randall's treatment had on her confidence, her sense of belonging, and the way it affected her desire to learn. As she spoke, she saw Mr. Randall's expression harden. His jaw clenched tightly. When it was his turn to speak, he adjusted his glasses, a faint sneer crossing his lips. "Miss Williams," he began, his voice cold, "has misunderstood my intentions. My teaching style is strict but fair, and I hold all students to the same high standards. Perhaps she mistook my critiques as personal when they were merely educational." Mrs. Hayes listened intently, her expression unreadable, while Mr. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus remained calm, his eyes fixed on Mr. Randall, with a look that conveyed both restraint and unwavering determination. Amara spoke up, her voice stronger than she expected. "Mr. Randall, your criticism went beyond constructive feedback. You singled me out repeatedly, dismissed my contributions, and undermined my efforts. This wasn't just about teaching. It was about who you think I am." Mr. Randall's face flushed, his defensiveness slipping momentarily. "Miss Williams, I expected more professionalism from you," he said, his tone laced with barely veiled irritation. "Perhaps this is a lesson in resilience, something I'm teaching all my students." At this, Marcus interjected calmly. "Mr. Randall, with all due respect, resilience shouldn't have to be a student's response to mistreatment. Our children come to school to learn, not to be subjected to the personal biases of those who are supposed to guide them." The weight of Marcus's words filled the room, his voice carrying a gravitas that silenced any further rebuttal from Mr. Randall. Mrs. Hayes nodded thoughtfully, taking notes before addressing the group. "Amara, thank you for your honesty. "This is not the first complaint we've received regarding discriminatory treatment in this school," she said, her gaze shifting to Mr. Randall. "These reports have compelled us to look deeper into the classroom environment, as every student deserves respect and fair treatment." The meeting adjourned with a promise from Mrs. Hayes that the school board would conduct a thorough investigation. As they exited the room, Marcus placed a protective arm around Amara's shoulders. Her heart felt lighter than it had in months, knowing that her voice had been heard and that change was on the horizon. In the following days, the news of the investigation spread throughout the school. Students whispered in hallways, and many reached out to Amara with words of support, commending her bravery. Some shared their own experiences, recounting moments when they, too, felt belittled by Mr. Randall's thinly veiled judgments. It became evident that Amara's courage had ignited a shift within the school, a silent revolution, challenging a culture that had long been left unchecked. As the investigation progressed, Mr. Randall's behavior grew erratic. His usual composure began to crack, revealing a bitterness that was hard for even him to disguise. He became more withdrawn, no longer attempting to address Amara or any students who sided with her. His cold stares intensified, yet Amara met each one with calm resolve, refusing to be intimidated. Then one day, a substitute teacher appeared in Mr. Randall's place. The class buzzed with curiosity and speculation, but Amara knew why he was absent. The school board had taken their first step, temporarily removing him from his position pending the outcome of the investigation. She felt a sense of relief mingled with sadness, not for him, but for all the students who had endured his mistreatment in silence for so long. With Mr. Randall gone, Amara noticed an immediate change in her classmates. The energy in the classroom shifted. There was laughter, camaraderie, a sense of freedom that hadn't been there before. Her friends no longer feared speaking up, sharing their ideas openly without the oppressive weight of judgment hanging over them. For the first time in months, Amara felt at ease in class, her love for learning rekindled. After school one day, Amara walked into her living room, where her father was waiting. He looked up, a small smile on his face. "You did it, kiddo," Marcus said, pride shining in his eyes. "You stood up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who needed to see that they don't have to accept mistreatment." Amara hugged him, feeling the strength of his support surrounding her. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. Thank you for being there, for believing in me." "Always," Marcus replied softly. "And remember, this is just the beginning. Standing up for yourself isn't something you do just once. It's a lifelong choice. But I know you're ready for it." As she looked around her now, in the warmth of her home and the embrace of her family, Amara felt a deep sense of pride. She had faced her fears, spoken her truth, and stood tall against those who tried to dim her light. And while she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for sure. She would never let anyone make her feel small again. The ripple effect. With Mr. Randall's absence, the atmosphere at Ridgeview Middle School transformed almost overnight. Students who had once feared his cold stares and biting remarks now entered his classroom with a lightness that hadn't been there before. The substitute teacher, Mrs. Larkin, was a kind woman with a welcoming smile and a genuine interest in her students' well-being. Her warmth provided a stark contrast to Mr. Randall's stern demeanor, and the class began to flourish in ways they hadn't imagined possible. Amara could feel the change, too. No longer weighed down by Mr. Randall's critical gaze, she found herself raising her hand more often, engaging in discussions without the nagging worry of being belittled. Her classmates also blossomed under this newfound freedom, sharing their ideas without fear of judgment. There was laughter in the room, camaraderie that hadn't existed under Mr. Randall's watch, and Amara couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. She had sparked something bigger than herself. But even as Amara relished this positive shift, the impact of her stand against Mr. Randall weighed on her in unexpected ways. Whispers had spread throughout the school, and she became somewhat of an unwitting symbol for resilience. While her friends and many teachers offered their support openly, she sensed a lingering tension from others. Some saw her actions as disruptive, questioning whether her stand had been necessary. One afternoon, Amara was approached by Ms. Fields, her history teacher, a gentle woman who had always shown kindness to her students. Ms. Fields smiled warmly, gesturing for Amara to stay back after class. "Amara, I just wanted to say that I admire your courage," Ms. Fields began, her voice filled with sincerity. "Standing up against injustice isn't easy, especially in an environment that often overlooks the struggles of students like you. Your actions didn't just change your life, they've affected all of us." Amara felt a swell of pride and gratitude. "Thank you, Ms. Fields. I never wanted to cause trouble, but I couldn't just stay silent." "Change is rarely comfortable," Ms. Fields continued, a hint of sadness in her tone. "But sometimes it's necessary, and because of you, others may find it easier to speak up in the future." As Amara left the classroom, Ms. Fields' words echoed in her mind. She realized the profound impact of her stand. Her actions had become a catalyst, setting off ripples of change that went beyond her immediate circle. Other students who had once felt marginalized were now finding their voices, empowered by the courage she had shown. Meanwhile, her father, Marcus, continued to support her in his own way. He had kept his distance from the school since the initial meeting, allowing the investigation to unfold naturally. He wanted Amara to experience the strength of her voice, to understand that her actions alone had been enough to bring about change. At home, he encouraged her to embrace her role as a leader, reminding her that standing up for herself was an achievement no one could take away. One evening, Marcus gathered Amara and her mother in the living room, a proud smile on his face. "I received a call from the school board today," he announced, his tone warm yet firm. "They concluded the investigation and are moving forward with a formal reprimand against Mr. Randall. He won't be returning to Ridgeview." Amara felt a mix of relief and sadness. While she was grateful that he wouldn't be able to mistreat anyone else, a part of her felt the weight of the outcome. She hadn't set out to ruin his career, only to seek fairness for herself and her peers. Yet, as her father had reminded her, accountability was essential in any community. As the news of Mr. Randall's official departure spread, students began to approach Amara with their own stories. They shared experiences of being overlooked, dismissed, or unfairly judged, revealing a pattern that went far beyond her own experiences. One student, a boy named Jason, confessed that Mr. Randall had made him feel less than because of his dyslexia, often dismissing his questions with impatience. "I thought I was the problem," Jason admitted, his voice soft but resolute. "But now, I realize it was him all along. Thank you for standing up. You made me feel like I wasn't alone." Amara was humbled by the impact she had made, her initial fear replaced with a sense of purpose. She decided to start a small club at school, where students could gather to discuss their experiences and support one another in a safe, judgment-free space. With the school's approval, she named it the Resilience Club, hoping it would serve as a beacon for anyone who felt silenced or marginalized. The Resilience Club quickly gained momentum, with students from all backgrounds joining. It became a place where they could voice their struggles and celebrate their victories, no matter how small. Amara led discussions on self-worth, courage, and the importance of supporting one another. She watched as students who had once been shy and withdrawn blossomed into confident vocal members of the group, their voices stronger because of the community they had built. One day, as Amara led a discussion on empathy, she noticed a familiar face standing near the door. It was Lily, the girl who had initially supported her against Mr. Randall. Lily hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, her expression a mix of gratitude and admiration. "Amara," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to thank you for creating this space. I used to think that standing up for myself was selfish, but you showed me that it's not. It's about valuing who you are." Amara reached out, pulling Lily into a warm embrace. "We're all in this together, Lily. And remember, your voice is just as powerful as anyone's." The club's success didn't go unnoticed by the school administration. The principal, Mr. Thomas, invited Amara to share her story with the faculty at an upcoming staff meeting. She was initially nervous, unsure if the teachers would welcome her message. But with her father's encouragement, she agreed, determined to spread awareness of the importance of treating every student with respect. On the day of the meeting, Amara stood in front of the faculty, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath, scanning the room filled with faces both familiar and new. Then, with the same calm strength that had carried her through the toughest months, she began to speak. "I'm here today because I believe that every student deserves respect, regardless of where they come from or who they are," she began, her voice steady. "When teachers believe in us, it changes everything. But when we feel overlooked or dismissed, it affects how we see ourselves. I hope that by sharing my story, we can create a school where every student feels valued." Her words resonated with the teachers, and several approached her afterward to express their gratitude. Some shared their own reflections, admitting that they, too, had biases to work through. It was a powerful moment of growth and understanding, one that Amara would remember for years to come. As she left the meeting, Amara felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. She had not only confronted a personal injustice, but had inspired a collective change within her school. Her courage had created a safer, more inclusive environment, one where students felt empowered to embrace their true selves. Walking home that afternoon, Amara marveled at how far she had come. The quiet girl who once worried about fitting in had grown into a leader, her voice stronger and clearer than ever. She knew that challenges would continue to arise, but she felt prepared, armed with the knowledge that she could face anything with courage and dignity. Her father's words echoed in her heart. Standing up for yourself isn't something you do just once. It's a lifelong choice. And Amara was ready, knowing that the journey she had started was far from over. The lessons she had learned would stay with her, guiding her as she continued to grow, uplift others, and champion the value of respect, dignity, and resilience for all. The legacy of courage. As the school year wound to a close, Amara took a moment to reflect on the journey that had shaped her in ways she never could have anticipated. The whispers of troublemaker and rule breaker that had once accompanied her presence in the halls of Ridgeview were replaced with nods of respect, quiet smiles, and an admiration that spoke volumes. She had become a symbol of resilience, not only for students who had once felt marginalized, but for the entire school community, which was forever changed by her courage. The Resilience Club had grown into something much larger than Amara had envisioned. What started as a small gathering of students sharing their experiences had become a well-organized group that facilitated workshops, hosted events, and even created an end-of-year presentation about the importance of inclusivity and mutual respect. Amara's friends, especially Lillian and Jason, had become key leaders in the club, each sharing their own stories and inspiring others to embrace their authentic selves. One afternoon, the school organized a community assembly, inviting parents, students, and teachers to celebrate the club's achievements. Amara was asked to speak, and though public speaking had once intimidated her, she accepted the invitation with confidence. Her father and mother were there, seated in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. Marcus gave her a thumbs up, and she felt the weight of his support steady her nerves. As Amara stepped onto the stage, she looked out at the audience, a sea of familiar faces, each one a part of the journey that had brought her here. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in the courage that had carried her this far. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady yet warm. "Today, I want to talk about the power of resilience. This year taught me that standing up for yourself and others isn't just about speaking out. It's about believing in your worth, even when others try to make you feel small." The room was silent, each word resonating with the audience as she continued. "There was a time when I thought I had to accept what others thought of me, to stay quiet, and just get through each day. But I've learned that true strength comes from within. When we refuse to let prejudice, bias, or anyone's narrow views define us, we find a strength that no one can take away." She glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly, pride shining in his eyes. Her mother wiped away a tear, her expression filled with warmth and admiration. Amara continued, her voice growing more confident with every word. Through the Resilience Club, I've seen what happens when we come together to create a space where everyone feels safe, heard, and valued. It's not just about confronting injustice. It's about building a community where everyone belongs. I'm grateful to each of you who believed in me, who joined the club, and who continue to stand up, not just for yourselves but for each other. The audience erupted into applause, their cheers filling the auditorium. As Amara stepped down from the stage, her friends and family surrounded her, each one expressing their admiration and gratitude. She felt a profound sense of accomplishment, knowing that her journey had not only empowered her but had also sparked a lasting change within her school. Following the assembly, Mrs. Hayes, the school board representative who had supported Amara's initial complaint, approached her with a smile. "Amara, your strength and courage have been nothing short of inspiring. I hope you know the impact you've made here." "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes," Amara replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never imagined it would turn into something like this, but I'm grateful for everything it's taught me." Mrs. Hayes nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Your story has reminded all of us of the importance of accountability and kindness. The school board has decided to incorporate more inclusive training for staff, and we're exploring ways to support students who feel marginalized. It's a small start, but it's because of you." As Mrs. Hayes walked away, Amara felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her journey had sparked a change within Ridgeview, creating ripples that would continue to shape the school's future long after she was gone. And yet, the greatest change had been within herself. The quiet, compliant girl she had once been had evolved into someone stronger, someone who knew her worth and refused to let anyone diminish it. Her father met her gaze, pride radiating from him. "You've changed lives, Amara," he said, pulling her into a tight hug. "And you've shown everyone, including yourself, just how strong you really are." The weeks that followed were filled with celebrations and farewells as the school year came to an end. Amara's story became a source of inspiration throughout the community, with news of her courage spreading beyond the school's walls. Local newspapers covered the story, interviewing her about the Resilience Club and the journey that had led her to become an advocate for inclusivity. But as the final day of school approached, Amara found herself reflecting on what lay ahead. She knew the challenges would continue. Life was filled with people like Mr. Randall, who would try to define her based on their limited views. But now, she knew that her worth wasn't something anyone else could dictate. On the last day of school, as she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, Amara took a final walk through the halls of Ridgeview. She passed the classroom where she had first encountered Mr. Randall's dismissive gaze, the same room that had once filled her with dread. But today, she felt no fear, only pride in how far she had come. The room that had once seemed cold and unwelcoming now felt like any other part of the school, a place where she had overcome obstacles, faced adversity, and emerged stronger. As she exited the school, her friends gathered outside, waving her over with excited shouts and laughter. They had planned a small farewell celebration in honor of Amara's impact on the school, each of them grateful for the support and encouragement she had shown them. Together, they walked to the nearby park, where they shared memories of the year, laughing and reminiscing about how they had come together as a community. Jason, one of the founding members of the Resilience Club, raised a cup in a toast to Amara for showing us that we don't have to accept anything less than respect. The group cheered, lifting their cups in unison. Amara felt her heart swell with gratitude, knowing that she had found a family in these friends who had stood by her through it all. As the sun set over the park, casting a warm glow over the group, Amara felt a deep sense of peace. She had faced the challenges, endured the hardships, and emerged stronger, more confident, and more determined to create a world where everyone felt valued. Her father's words echoed in her mind once more. Standing up for yourself isn't something you do just once. It's a lifelong choice. And as she looked around at the friends and mentors who had supported her journey, She knew she was ready for whatever lay ahead. With her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering belief in her worth, Amara was prepared to face the future, knowing that no matter what challenges came her way, she would never back down. Her story was far from over. It was only just beginning. And she would carry the lessons of Ridgeview with her forever, a legacy of courage that would inspire others for years to come. Maya offered a small, weary smile, her gaze steady as she looked at him. It's not the first time, and it won't be the last. But it means a lot to know that there are people who care, who are willing to stand up for what's right. Eric felt a surge of determination, a renewed commitment to the path he had chosen. Maya's strength, her resilience, it was a beacon, a reminder of the impact he could have if he stayed true to his promise, if he continued to see the world through the lens of empathy and respect. People like you deserve that and more, he said quietly, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. If there's anything you need, Maya, anything I can do, just let me know. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, Eric felt a connection, a bond forged not only from gratitude, but from the shared understanding of the journey he was on, the journey she had inspired. As he and Tom made their way back to the patrol car, Eric felt a sense of peace settle within him, a calm certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. He had taken the first steps, small but meaningful, toward becoming the officer and the person he wanted to be. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, moments that would test his resolve and push him to confront his biases over and over again. But he was no longer afraid of that struggle. Driving away from Bloom and Bliss, Eric felt a deep gratitude for the lessons he'd learned, the courage he'd found in others, and the opportunity to become a better man. And as the city lights passed by, flickering in the growing dusk, he felt a new sense of purpose blooming within him, a purpose rooted not in the past, but in the hope and promise of change.